to do really is to find out a little bit about you and your experiences of intercultural training. So I'm going to share a poll with you. So if you'd like to choose the option that works best for you and just vote for us, and then that gives us a sense of who you are and what your own experiences are. So you should, yeah, lovely, I can see it's working now. So as the last option says, if it's something completely different, feel free to share with us what your experience or your reason for being here is. But equally, feel free to remain anonymous if you prefer. Lovely. So it looks that quite a few of you are just curious, which is always good. I'm a big fan of curiosity, but nice to see that some of you are already running programs or perhaps thinking about doing so in the near or not so near future. So thank you for doing that. Let me just share the results with you so you can see. You should now see the percentage breakdown. And nice to see there are some trainers in the room as well, so hopefully you'll share your experiences as well. So we're having a few coordination challenges, but we'll get there.
Yep. So I think this webinar is going to be a little different from maybe some of the ones that we've done in the past. We want to keep it a little bit of a conversation, more of an open dialogue. We'll be sharing our experiences or being providers of intercultural training, but just as well, we're keen to hear from you about your experiences and what's worked and what hasn't and what you're looking for, in essence. And to sort of start that off, we wanted to ask you, what are the ingredients for successful intercultural training, in your opinion? So feel free to use the text function to drop in your feedback in the box.
In the box.
Yes, in this box. Or in the chat box, as you wish. And we'll just use that and kind of get a feel from the crowd about what you think makes intercultural training successful and what you need. And then we'll kind of take you through what we view to be things to consider as you're approaching it. And given that a lot of people are just curious to know, hopefully we'll give you some frameworks to think about if you launch into getting some intercultural training for your teams. So let's see what the audience has to say. It's always fun during these moments. You almost wish there was a little bit of a drum roll.
Yeah.
See you right. People come with. Yeah.
And I think as well, if perhaps you don't have much experience with intercultural training, but you work in other areas of training, there might be some transferable ingredients, if you like, that are just as relevant for intercultural. Interesting. It's a really good question. Thank you, Emma. A definition of intercultural training. I think sometimes when you work in something, you assume that everyone understands what you mean. So for us, intercultural training is about helping people, professional people in our case, to work more effectively with people from other cultures and other backgrounds. So from our perspective, we look at how values impact on behaviours and where there are differences, how you bridge those gaps, and also how you maximise the benefits of working with cultural diversity. Is that enough of a definition for you, Emma? Perhaps put your hand up if you're okay with it and tell me if you need more. Okay, lovely. And always feel free to disagree. I should have said that early on. So I don't know whether you have any thoughts or ideas or whether it's a technical issue, but do feel free just to put in, it could just be a couple of words or ideas for what makes a successful program. But otherwise we'll move on and share our ideas. We'll just give you a few more seconds. Should we? Yeah, share? Keep on thinking and writing, but we'll move on and share.
So Emma's just shared engaging, translate into impact, most definitely. I think actually your question of what the definition of intercultural training is so important, because it's one of those training topics that I think people find difficult to pinpoint what exactly it is. It's quite easy if you've gotten a piece of software and then you know you need to train the team on how to use it and the process and the protocol, but there's something almost slightly intangible about intercultural training because it's so geared towards your own awareness, your own understanding, and how you can adjust a little bit so that you're more successful in your interactions. So most definitely kind of translating into impact, and we'll get into that later in the webinar, but how exactly do you measure the impact when it's not quite as measurable as, say, training your team on fire safety, for example, which we all have to do, and then doing a quiz at the end of it. So, yeah.
I think the other thing I would say in terms of the definition is that it's changed hugely in the time I've been working in this area. So intercultural training used to be much more about country briefings, and well, fortunately, I think from my perspective, the way of global working is much more complex nowadays, and training has had to respond to that in terms of working much more with global teams, working across multiple geographies, and again, that's something we'll refer to later on. So
perfect. So just a quick overview of some of the areas that we're going to cover, because in essence, these are what we believe to be the ingredients that you need in order to find the right type of intercultural training for you. And it all sort of starts with the audience of who exactly needs intercultural training, finding the right trainer who has the expertise and the knowledge and the skills to be able to be the most effective facilitator for training. Considering what you want your participants to gain from the learning experience. So do you do it more as a workshop style? Do you do it more as a webinar or a lecture? Or do you do it more as a one-on-one? The content, so the meat of the training and what exactly is necessary. And then again, the point about the results. So how do you measure whether or not it's been successful and whether it's given people the tools? And I guess you'll find that the combination or the stresses all really depends on why you need intercultural training to begin with. And then kind of considering the various options and the various combinations where, you know, in some instances maybe the content is quite important because it's about something very specific, whereas other areas you might have big groups of people and then it's sort of determining how do you split your audience and that kind of thing. So we'll drill down into each of these areas a little bit more and essentially kind of give you some questions to consider, some factors to keep in mind when you're looking for your intercultural training. So, starting with your audience, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So one of the questions I think we wanted to ask you guys, let's start with the question, is what do you think is the optimum group size for intercultural training? I'm going to be intentionally vague in my asking of this question. But what do you think is the optimal group size? Okay, got some people saying 6, 10 to 12.
It's a little bit like asking how long is a piece of string, but it'd be interesting to see your thoughts.
Okay. So we seem to have people looking in groups rather than kind of the one-to-one style of thing, which is quite interesting. Let's share these results. So the majority of people think it's about 10 to 12 people, and then there are other votes for 6 and for 20. Now, as I said, I was intentionally vague in this question, so it's a little bit unfair. But I think part of it is, okay, who needs the training and what is the request? But if you are looking for training solutions for groups, we tend to find that the optimal size is about 10 to 12. Because it means that you can interact with the trainer, you can break out into small groups and actually get engagement from teams. We're just delivering some training earlier this morning, and one of the things that the trainer mentioned when she started off the session was the fact that, you know, as much as she can teach the group, there's so much knowledge that exists within the group. So kind of keeping sizes to 10 to 12 just really lets everybody learn from each other. And, you know, as Kathy was mentioning, because the world's become a lot more globalized, a lot of people have different experiences, and it's less of the country briefing style and more of the collaborative discussions. So, you know, having the groups in a slightly smallish environment allows for that discussion and that engagement. I
mean, I think probably the most important thing is shared objectives and shared outcomes. You know, so if you have a large group of people who have very similar outcomes and it's a question of sensitization, then that can work. But if we're bringing it into, you know, some of these points on the slide around Should it be team specific? Should it be mixed nationalities, hierarchy? I think, well, for me, there's two things. One is, like I say, the shared outcomes, but it's also perhaps being sure that everyone feels comfortable sharing sometimes quite personal information. So I know sometimes our clients will say, should we mix managers and their reports in the same session? And unfortunately, we're not always going to give you clear-cut answers to some of these questions, but I think it's more that they're questions that need thought, and every context is slightly different. The same with the mixed and mono-national groups. There's pros and cons, aren't there, I think? Yeah. So we've worked with clients that do both ways. I think sometimes if an organisation is new to working in a new environment, a new market, there's something quite reassuring about having a trainer where you can speak very freely about your frustrations with that other culture without feeling that you're offending people. But equally, there's great learning from getting everyone in the room together. I mean, there's a quote here from one of our clients who really feels it's so important that we do mix up the nationalities when we work with them.
And sometimes it's worth considering if it's a multi-part training program. So one of our clients that we work with, they have teams based in the UK and then they have teams based in India. And so what we've done, because it was new environments for both teams that they previously hadn't worked with either group, was we did training for each of the cultures. For the UK-based team about India, for the Indian-based team about the UK and the States. But what we've also suggested is maybe to do training with all of them together on a different topic. So it's not necessarily about the intercultural training, but more about how do you work with the global team, how do you work in a diverse group. So that can sometimes help because you give them the ability to sort of be quite open and, as Kathy said, sort of air out any issues or frustrations or challenges they have in a set environment, and then kind of having learnt from it and discussed it, come together to just talk about how do we work together successfully.
I remember very early on, actually, when I was first working in this area, and I went to observe a training session in Germany, and it was a mix of predominantly German and Brits who are working together, and a few other European nationalities. And I was in the back of the room, and the trainer set up this exercise where each nationality group worked together, and the question was, what do you find challenging about working with your peers from X, and what do you enjoy? And I had quite a nervous moment worrying about what was going to come out of this, but it was actually really fruitful in terms of people actually being able to explain why they worked in certain ways and what the rationale was for things which were seemingly frustrating to the other side. So again, I think it comes back to that, making sure that the trainer has created a very kind of safe space for people to talk openly.
Yeah. And then to kind of build on that as well, it's a question of when you're forming your groups, how do you frame it to the people who are coming for training? So that's a bit of our point about, is it mandatory, is it proactive or reactive? I think sometimes you find with this type of training that it might make people slightly defensive if they're like, oh, is there an issue with how I'm dealing with people from different cultures or my colleagues or my clients, and is that why I've been asked to do this training? So if they almost see it as remedial, then maybe their approach to the training won't be seen as I'm walking into a safe environment where I can learn and I can grow my awareness, and more of like, I've been pinpointed that something is wrong and I need to change how I do it. So a lot of the times we might even discuss with them how you frame it or how you position it to people, that actually this is just going to help you communicate more effectively, because communication has so many layers and so many levels, and it's not just about the language you use, it's not just about kind of the method that you use, but a lot of the nuances might be due to some cultural differences that maybe you hadn't been aware of. So almost sort of framing it as though this will help you to communicate more effectively, because we'll share the frameworks of how people's different culture can affect how they might approach working with you. But yeah, that's kind of something most definitely to keep in mind.
And I've worked with some very enlightened organisations where intercultural training has been mandatory, and I've been very impressed by those companies, but it has led to occasional experiences where people have been sent on the training not really knowing why, and I've even heard people say, I don't need to be fixed, I'm fine as I am. So I think it reinforces your point around how it's positioned internally as well, and how line managers encourage their staff to get the most from these kind of courses.
Yeah.
So, trainers.
Yes, another key ingredient, of course, is who's going to do the training. So I guess a question for you, Kathy. When you think about how do you pick the right trainer for a particular course or a particular client, what are the things you think about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's three things which are absolutely given, which are all our trainers, and I think for most people it's important to have international experience of working. So they've been there and done it themselves, and they can empathise with the client group they're working with. Then obviously they need the knowledge of what we're talking about, so the intercultural frameworks. Now there's no one recognised qualification in intercultural, so we find some of our trainers will have a master's in intercultural management, but not all of them. Some will come from a coaching background, some have very strong HR backgrounds before they moved into training, but they need to know their stuff in effect. And the third element is around their facilitation skills, so creating that comfortable space, for example. But I have just kind of drilled down into a little bit, more detail. And I've kind of divided it into 4 key areas. So the first is around their credibility, because I think, you can have been there and done it, have fantastic knowledge, but you actually need to fit within the organisation. So, if I'm sending someone into a tech company, I want to feel confident that trainer gets what it means to work in that environment, and they speak the language of the client. So I don't mean they speak German or French, but they speak the kind of the organizational language, and some of the challenges that those people are experiencing will resonate with them as well. It's interesting about the credentials, because I think this is a cultural thing in itself. In some cultures, as a trainer, it's very important at the beginning to spend, perhaps 15 minutes introducing yourself, setting out your qualifications, where you did your PhD, what business school you went to. But probably here in the UK, I don't know if you agree, but it's much more important to know what they've done, that have they been there, done it piece. But whatever that culture needs, it's showing that they have the credentials to deliver and to meet their needs. And then the expertise. I think this kind of speaks for itself, but both with the knowledge of the cultures, but also the sort of intercultural knowledge. Do they keep up to date? Yeah. If you did a master's 10 years ago, actually it's a very fast evolving field. Yeah. Things change. So do they regularly sort of improve on their CPD and so on?
Yeah. We in one of our training sessions, somebody was actually it was a general course about working across different cultures, and one of the questions that they had was, I'm also keen to know about how it changes across generations. So, for example, I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and I haven't been back in about 8 years, and the country has changed quite a lot since I last left it. So it's not just about knowing what a place was like, but if it's gone through immense change, recognizing that it might mean that future generations don't necessarily think the way that what theory or whatnot might have thought it was in the past. So like in Saudi, for example, it's 50% of the population is under the age of 25 and 18. So that's a whole new generation that doesn't think in kind of the way that previous ones have. So yeah, important to kind of be mindful of the changes that are happening.
So someone might have 20 years experience of doing business in China, but if that was back in the 80s and 90s, how valid is that for, going into a young global organization, perhaps in Shanghai, where things have become a lot more Western? So then the training skills, and again, it's a given really, but have people actually deliver training in that environment? So whether it's a corporate or in the charity sector, we work a lot with universities, and then we expect our trainers to have some level of background in teaching within the university environment, for example. And I think I won't speak to each of the bullet points, but I think one thing that's so important is good levels of emotional intelligence. So as I said, sometimes quite sensitive stuff comes up. I've also seen groups that very much disagree with what the trainer's saying. So needing to have that ability to manage difficult moments, to manage sensitivities and deal with pushback and resonate with the group, I think, in terms of what they're experiencing. And then my final one is the hardest one to measure for me, but it's do they have that chemistry? Are they going to fit with the client? Will they engage the people they're training with? And like I say, that's a hard one to measure, but we do have a sense of often who will work with different client types. And I guess it would be, I've talked for quite a while now, so it'd be interesting to hear your experiences. Have you had examples where a trainer has just got it so right? And what was it they did that made that program such a success? And perhaps equally you have negative examples where there just hasn't been that fit and it hasn't worked. And we'd love if you feel comfortable for you to share any experiences you may have had. We'll just give you a moment.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the other things I was mentioning when we were putting together the slides is I grew up as a third culture kid, as we're called. My dad spent his career out in the Middle East. Ethnically, I'm from Bangladesh, but I studied in the UK and then worked in Canada. And one of the things I found really interesting about all the intercultural training that we're delivering is you have more and more people who've had very diverse experiences, or they've traveled abroad, or even, for example, the training I was mentioning today, a lot of the people were London-based, and they said, just the way London is as a city means that you get exposure to so many different cultures. So one of the things I think that's quite important also with the intercultural training is ensuring that the trainer recognizes that piece that we mentioned earlier, that there's as much to be learned from the people in the room as there is from themselves, because you can sometimes fall into the trap of just preaching and saying this is how something is. But by recognizing that maybe it can be a bit of a discussion as well. So
it seems like people are shy today, which is fine. maybe you're kind of looking for sort of best practice from us rather than sharing your own experiences. But feel free at any point to join in. Can I just have a show of hands that everyone can still hear and see us? Okay.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
Okay. Perfect.
Lovely, thank you. Well, we'll move on, but as I say, if you want to share any examples.
And also, if you have any questions along the way, just feel free to let us know. Excellent. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
It's always nice when you ask for a show of hands and there's like a flurry of
You are still with us, which is good. Yeah. So the next part is what we've called the learning experience. And I think this is really encapsulates a number of different things. I don't know, shall I talk about this? Sorry. Sure. So I think these are the very sort of practical things, but it does matter in terms of a good experience. Now, for us, at least, our standard kind of program duration is a day. We would love to work with people for 2-3 days to really go deep into the practice and get people experimenting, doing detailed role plays and so on, but we appreciate that's not always possible. People can't take that length of time away from their desks so often these days. So we take quite a pragmatic approach. We do run half-day programs, and I think, again, the same with the group size, any duration works as long as we're clear what the outcomes are going to be. We can do an hour. We're doing an hour today. All these webinars are an hour, and hopefully people take something from them, but it's never going to be as in-depth as when we spend a day with you on the ground.
And sometimes it helps, particularly if people are new to this kind of training or the theory or anything, to have it almost in parts.
Yes.
So you do a part one and then let people sit and kind of internalize things and maybe put things into action, and then have a part two later on as well. And we've also found with some training that, we've done a general session, and then from that, looking at the feedback, that's actually given us ideas from the people who've attended that actually I would really like to maybe focus on a particular communication skill or a particular leadership style or management technique, and then kind of building on that and keeping it fairly organic. I think the other thing that we've talked a bit about is where to do the training. And there's some convenience if you can do it at the location where everybody is based, but we did have one client actually that preferred to have everybody come over to our center here, because it just meant that everybody could properly check out from work, because there's always that risk that if you're doing training in just a boardroom just by your desk, that when you go for a break, all of a sudden what you've actually do for your day job kind of catches up with you a little. And so sometimes it's nice to have it in an environment where you can just focus on that and focus on the training. And then one of the other things I think that technology is also allowed to change is does it have to be face-to-face, or can it be online or virtual, a bit like these webinars? We've done online workshops as well, so you can still get quite a lot of those face-to-face features, I guess, for the lack of a better word.
Obviously we're a big group today, we've got a lot of people on the meeting, but if we had a kind of more intimate group of 6, we would have you using your microphones as well, using the webcam. And I think if you're working in a global team, working with people that you never meet, as probably most of us do these days, why not do the training that replicates that virtual environment and experience some of those challenges that we face in our day jobs, so the location can actually be here in this virtual room as well as in a training room.
And with a lot of the technologies, you can do things like breakout rooms, so have little discussions that are going on in the same way that you would sort of split people up in a physical room. So that's also one of the things, I think, when we were touching on the audience, it depends on what you're able to do and maybe sort of what budgets you have or how many people need training. That, for example, if you're looking to train a team of 30 people and it's not possible to do that face-to-face, then you can look into, okay, maybe everybody does a 2-hour webinar that's split into groups of 10, and then only for specific people we'll do some face-to-face training. So it's keeping quite fluid with the delivery mode, and that's always a function of who needs the training, what do they need it for, and what are you hoping to accomplish in the training.
Yeah, I mean, here's a question for you, if you're open to answering, is how do you feel new learning technologies can support this kind of intercultural training? Does it work, and how can it be best married together? So how can we use technology in intercultural training? But perhaps as you're thinking and answering, we can just move on to the next piece, which I think with some of what you were saying around part 1 and part 2, it's this idea that, I know it sounds a bit cheesy, but really for us the training needs to be a journey of learning rather than a sort of a one-off event. So what happens before the face-to-face, if it's face-to-face, or the virtual classroom, what happens afterwards is almost just as important as what goes on in the training. So what we try and do is certainly to get people to reflect beforehand, maybe certainly answer some questionnaires, but perhaps review some literature as well, or look at a case study, so that they're really engaged with the topic before they come in. And then again after the training, what are they actually going to do with it? So something we do at the end of any course is ask people to complete an action plan. And as a minimum, we'll follow up and say, well, what are you doing? You said you were going to try that new technique. Have you done that? What's next for you? Here are some more tips that you can look at. And I think that's a really important part of keeping learners engaged. And actually, I think Emma made the point about impact and results at the beginning. Sorry, I'm just looking at the comments now.
We've had a couple of people say that the technology can help if people are located in different parts of the world, so it's easier to log in online. And I think that's another thing that, what kind of access to what kind of intercultural training do you have in your home country, and is it quite developed? I mean, it's still fairly new in the western part of the world, so sometimes it might be good to be able to access an online workshop from different parts. Emma's made the point as well of if you work in this way, it makes sense. And for example, we have a course that's managing virtual teams, which we deliver through a virtual webinar, because part of it is, well, if you're managing the virtual team, you should probably try it in a webinar environment.
I think, Emma, you make a good point that it can be much harder to engage with learners. Yeah. If I could see you and look you in the eye and see whether you were responding to what I was saying, I would find my job a bit easier. I think as trainers we have to work harder in the virtual environment, but again, using cameras, using lots of polls and getting people to participate, it can't come 100% the same as face-to-face, but it can come pretty close. Yeah. Mohammed, I'm curious, you say you prefer online training these days. Would you mind explaining why, just out of curiosity?
Time zones, that's also a very valid point. You can't always get everybody at the right time. We've recently done some webinars for our language school side of things, and one of my colleagues was asking what's the optimal, and I used to do quite a lot of webinars when I was in Canada, and I was like, I think the sweet spot I've discovered is 12 p.m. UK time, because that's 9 a.m. on the west coast of North America and South America, and then that's kind of midday in the Middle East, and it's about 5 o'clock in India, and then it's about 8 o'clock in the Far East, and then you'll have some very dedicated people that will be calling in at 11, 12 o'clock midnight from even further out. But time zones can be quite challenging.
I mean, we do these at 1 o'clock
Yep.
for that reason, and I know we often have people who are up or in the office quite late in East Asia, but then in Latin America it's earlier in the morning for you guys. We did something for a team in Australia a couple of weeks ago, so I was at home at my laptop at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it was late for them. So I think, but everything is possible, and it's just being aware of some of these challenges, and then we can do our best to mitigate some of the negatives.
Yeah. And Mohammed, thank you for elaborating that it's kind of when we're quite busy, we don't have enough time. So you tend to find with these online training workshops or webinars that they're bite-sized, and part of that is because they're quite high intensity. If you do face-to-face, you can almost read the room to see if there's naturally a break. I think luckily we're kind of used to doing these webinars, but there are even moments, even if you've done 100 of them, where you're like, have I lost them? And you might find yourself as a presenter being a little bit more needy, but it's more just, you can't see the nodding heads around the room that you could in the face-to-face, but there are most definitely ways. And I think one of the other things with more and more people having done webinars is the attendees are aware of that too. So we very much appreciate that every time we ask you to raise your hand, you're not looking at us like, again. But sometimes you need that just to make sure everyone's with you.
Hopefully you're smiling back at us, even though we can't see. So I guess the nitty-gritty is it's all about the content of the training, what makes one program better than another. And again, we're sharing some thoughts, some ideas here, but there are, you probably have your own thoughts and ideas as well.
And I think I would say it's always, I think this is true for any sort of training or anything in general, really. You need to manage the expectations and ensure that whatever you're creating, content, timing-wise, will meet those expectations. And I think sometimes, people might want to bite off more than they can chew and say, oh, we want to cover absolutely everything, like the basis of sort of intercultural training in general, but then let's also throw in some email writing, and let's also throw in some presentation, and you're sort of like, maybe you almost need to unpack parts of it. But what also helps, I think, is when we had said earlier about how you advertise any sort of training and letting people know that this is what you can hope to learn from being a part of this training can very much help, so that people know, okay, well, this is what, after 3 hours, after 6 hours, these are some of the things I'll have more awareness about. And, customizing it as well, in ensuring that it's not, as Kathy said, that's a big part of picking the right trainer, so that, if it's training for a financial services company, then maybe somebody who's had some experience in that industry, as opposed to somebody who's maybe only worked with in the education environment or something like that. But that might be the small thing where the content might just be about working across cultures, but the fact that the facilitator has a lot of experience working in that industry means that when examples are thrown out, they are able to relate it or kind of bring it back to how it would impact somebody's role.
I think one thing I would say with regard to the customization piece, particularly any of you who are looking at working with providers, whether it's us or another company, the more time you can give us and the more information you can give us, the better the program, the better the results will be. I love it when I'm given access to stakeholders within the business and I can actually speak on the phone with half a dozen people before we design the program and really understand how the company works, what the culture is, what the challenges are, what their experiences have been so far, both negative and positive. That doesn't mean that we don't do our own desk research as well. So again, going back to the trainer, a good trainer would have been on the client website, really understood not just their geographies and where they work and what they do, but perhaps their core values, their overriding mission statement, that kind of thing.
I guess the one question I have for you is sometimes people, there needs to be a balance, I think, between like the theory that exists in intercultural training and the practical of like the experiences that you have. So how do you balance that? Because some people might say, well, I've lived it, so I have a certain knowledge that doesn't exist in the academic theory world. So how do...
it's a question that clients always ask us as well. My take on this is that we need to, as trainers, we need to know the theory and understand the theory inside out, but we're not giving an academic class. That said, some of the models that we use provide really useful frameworks that we can kind of pin our experiences on. So some of you may be familiar with the kind of dimensional approach to culture, where we look at things like, is a culture perhaps more hierarchical or more egalitarian? Are they comfortable with risk or not so comfortable, and so on? We're not giving a whole theoretical expose, but we are using the framework for people to perhaps understand where miscommunication and frustration that they've experienced has come from. And also, I think, increasingly important, how to leverage those differences to actually make something more positive, if that makes sense. And I think from the trainer perspective as well, some of the theories now that have been around perhaps since the 70s and 80s are sometimes criticised, and perhaps rightly so. So a good trainer needs to be able to manage those criticisms and, you know, take them on board and perhaps defend them as appropriate, but be very comfortable with the pros and cons. I mean, I always talk about theory as a kind of a springboard to discussion rather than a theory in itself, because for most of our clients it's the practice, it's the reflection, it's the so what. Okay, we understand the differences, but what do we do about it? And
I think for me as well, because I didn't come from the academic background, one of the nice things for the theories and the frameworks that exist is they kind of make things make a little bit more sense. So for myself, like, I'm like, oh, okay, well, in this way I'm very Bangladeshi, whereas in this way I'm very Canadian. And it's just, sometimes it kind of at least gives you somewhere to put all these things that you've had exposure to in a, I don't know if it's a quantifiable way, but in a more structured way that you're able to understand it. But it's changing as well too, which is, I think, is that important part, that it's, you know, what might have worked 30 years ago maybe doesn't fit the mold for right now, but it's somewhere to start.
And to go back to your point about, well, I could have just lived it, been there and done it, worked in China for 5 years. One of the key messages in all our training is the danger of stereotyping. So I may have had a very different experience in China than you did. My experience of Bangladesh will obviously be different to yours. And it becomes a series of personal anecdotes rather than something more meaningful. So I think it is important to have that theory underpinning. Does anyone have any questions or comments at this point before we move on?
We are going to ask you for your opinion on a scenario.
Ta-da!
Ta-da! So we thought this might be quite interesting, and we'll see if you guys will join us on this, or if not, then we can kind of talk through what we would recommend. But if you were presented with this scenario, that you have a new CEO joining, they'll be based in the UK, but there are operations in these 3 parts of the world. They're originally from Australia, they've worked a lot in Asia, they've spent some time in the States, but they've not worked with Europe before. What would you suggest, or what would you do? So again, keeping in mind those sort of, we'll leave it at the 4 because we're getting to the ROI bit next, but more of the content, the trainer, the audience, and the experience. Sort of, what might you suggest for somebody in this position? So you can let us know in the chat function, and we'll see how that goes. But if we're feeling maybe not so sure about sharing that, then we'll kind of give you our thoughts.
These are real examples, aren't they? So
and it's just sometimes, because we often have people call in being like, I really have no idea where to start. So we can kind of talk them through and say, hey, maybe this is what might work, may not work. So yes, let us know what you think.
So I think this was one of your clients, wasn't it? So we can share what we did propose.
Indeed. Give you guys a couple minutes.
Yeah, the second one was something I worked on last year, so they're both real life examples.
And sort of a good examples of how training can be so different, that sometimes it might be individuals and then sometimes. Okay. So we've got some points about how we need to hear from the new CEO first, and this will guide how we pitch this. Somebody else has said that they have a lot of experience. So, I mean, I can fill in the gaps, given that this was a real life example. So with this CEO, it was very much specifically about learning about these cultures, because in terms of their management and leadership experience, they already had all the tools that they needed, mainly because, you know, to be able to go into this role, you sort of need those set. But the area that they'd identified for themselves that there was a little bit of a gap was knowing about these cultures and more taking the existing skills that they possessed and making sure that they were effective in these cultures. They'd had more exposure to non-European cultures, so they knew that, you know, their style, for example, like worked in the States because they were from Australia, or maybe worked in Asia because they'd had that exposure. So what we ended up recommending here was sort of one-to-one training focused on these key cultures to give you a summary of what these cultures are like and how they might work, and then sort of also suggesting a bit of a psychometric tool that would allow them to analyze their own competencies, and then say, okay, based on these cultures, you might want to lean in on this competency, you might want to pull back on this one, you might want to explore and grow and improve this particular area. But it was more about, they already had the toolkit of the skills they needed, but what do I tweak and what do I change so that I'm more effective in these cultures?
And I'll talk about that psychometric tool in a moment, actually, as well. Perhaps should we have a quick look at this second example? This was perhaps more straightforward. It was a small team working on a knowledge transfer project with an outsourcing partner in India. They were only going across for a few weeks, and it was a very short project anyway, but they wanted some kind of support and training. So again, same question to you, what would you recommend? And Emma, I take your point that you always need to hear from the user, the participant, the CEO in the former case, but often people will still want us to give some kind of guidance in terms of what it could look like, and then obviously we fill the gaps by talking to the participants. Yes, Cecilia, it's much more specific, and perhaps in the for the sake of time, we ran a very straightforward one-day program on working with India. It was designed around the guys that were moving over there, but we also brought in some of the team that were working virtually, so they were able to empathise with their colleagues who were going to be over there for a couple of months, and B, they got some of that learning around how to collaborate virtually with the Indian team they were working with. So yes, you're right, that was a more straightforward and more specific example.
But this is where also the difference between when you might recommend one-to-one, when you might recommend group, which team members do you bring on? Do you just focus on the people who are actually going over? Do you incorporate some of the existing team? Sort of that balance, because, you know, it's easy enough to say, okay, maybe just the people who are going are the ones we're going to do training for. And I mean, we've also done training with some other clients where if it's a certain team that's now managing a new group, that we've done training for the managers, but then we've also done training for the teams that they manage, because it's just as much of a culture shift for them to suddenly have this new management style in place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Do you do
co-creation exercises?
If I understand you correctly, we do sometimes design, for example, role plays and simulations with the client. So we'll get the scenario from them, and then we do the kind of the cultural part, but we get the bones of the exercise from the client in advance. I'm not sure if that's what you mean, Emma. Apologies if I've not understood.
And we have even done it with some teams where we've put together their briefs or their action plans or their values, for example. If this is particularly, I think, when we've done training around communication skills or focus on a key area, being like, these are the things that we think as a team we should have as the pillars. Like actually giving them the opportunity to brainstorm how they would like to move forward with a particular skill, and then they can kind of take that and be like, right, this is our team mantra now.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so it's great so one of the examples I gave before where I talked about having interviews with the stakeholders, it was a program for expats coming into the UK. So as well as speaking to some of them beforehand, I spoke to some of the British managers who'd worked in the same organisation in the same location for 30 years to kind of get the reverse perspective. So So I don't want to spend a long time on it, but I thought it might be useful just to touch on some of the many online tools that are available in the intercultural training world. My experience has been that a lot of clients will ask for a blended approach, and there are a lot of tools out there. I won't spend a lot of time on these, but if you're interested, I can always give you more information. I think really there's two types of tools. There are the very large scale, what I would call comparative tools, where they look at, well, this is what you're like, and here's culture B, here's culture C, here are the gaps. Things like Culture Wizard, Globe Smart, and Country Navigator, you can see those on the left of the screen. They tend to be available on very large scale, so it tends to be that the organisation buys 3,000 licenses, for example, and they give a very kind of quick and easy glimpse of what it means to work with another culture, and you see a very visual idea of where those gaps are. The one thing I would say is they can be a little bit simplistic, they can risk stereotyping, overgeneralizing, but I've known a lot of organizations really love these tools, and it means you can get the information to many more people. On our right side, we've got perhaps the more, I don't want to use the word more sophisticated, but more complex tools which really look much more internally. So the International Profiler and the International Preferences Indicator that we use are very much based around looking at our own competencies, our own attitudes, and it's not really comparing with any other culture. It's much more understanding our own gaps and how we might need to adapt. If anyone's interested, I can give you more information, and you can find all these tools online. And I think they're a useful addition, but I don't think they can ever take the place of the kind of, whether it's face-to-face or virtual, but the live element of training. But they're useful and they can help.
So it kind of brings us to the final piece, which is the results and the ROI. So when you have all of those four ingredients, then the main question is you've taken all that time to put together that type of training, but you need to make sure that it's effective. So a question to you first, which is, do you think it's possible to measure the ROI of intercultural training? Yes or no? And then you can let us know in the chat box why you think so. And then we'll sort of take you through some of the ways that we've found people have been able to measure it. Depends on if we mean money or value. Very true. Yep. That's often, yeah, it's one of those training things that you can't always see the exact link to the revenue or the amount, but you can sort of see the impacts in other ways, like time or cohesion with the team, or they're just more effective and efficient.
And I think any kind of soft skills training are notoriously difficult to measure ROI. That said, I mean, to your question, Emma, particularly in the expatriate world, I don't know if any of you work in the global mobility sphere, but there are a lot of stats out there around the cost of a failed international assignment, the attrition rates of returning expats who the evidence shows that they tend to leave their companies very quickly. So you can actually put a pound sign on some of those things. But yeah, traditionally with these, as I say, softer skills programs, it's harder to put a monetary value on it, but there are other ways of measuring.
And yes, Cecilia, you make a good point that if they feel they can communicate more easily, then you can use their feedback. So some of the ways that we've outlined it are, so with one of our clients, we actually did a workshop about email writing, and what the client ended up doing was a few months later was asking the line manager, have you found that it's easier to communicate with them? Has the overall communication in your team improved? And they said, yeah, you could most definitely see it, and part of that was because emails were less, not everybody was getting copied in on certain things. There weren't misunderstandings because people were using the wrong language. Yeah. So it's one of those things that if you have less issues coming up, then maybe that's a way to see that the ROI isn't there. And one of the measurable ways, or if you had projects and they were constantly being delayed and now they're all being delivered on time, that's a tangible way to measure it. Or if the team morale is a little bit better, or things are a little bit smoother and there aren't so many tensions within the team because of communication or cultural misunderstanding, then those are ways to sort of see it.
Yeah, and I think some contexts are slightly easier than others. So the customer service, if you've got the satisfaction scores before the training, then afterwards, and you can see an improvement. But then, even that said, can you attribute the full value of those increased scores to the training? Maybe you can, but it is arguable. But I think it comes back to hopefully one of the points that we've been highlighting throughout the session around really knowing what your desired outcomes are at the beginning, and at least that gives you something that you can try to measure after the program.
And even the first bullet point is very much tied to that. You manage the expectations, you deliver a training that meets them, and then you sort of ask for people to be held accountable to some extent of taking what they've learned in the training and putting it into practice. So, maybe following up after a couple months being like, this was the thing you planned to stop, this was you planned to start, this was what you were going to continue doing. Have you done that? Has that worked? Has it not worked? Just having those kind of measures in place in the same way you would for any other training. And I think what we sort of wanted to end with, I guess, is the final, question is like, who delivers the training? Who do you choose?
This is almost the elephant, if you will, in the light, because obviously we're presenting to you in the position of a training provider, but I imagine some of you may be in-house trainers in your organisation and you're already doing this. Some of you perhaps work with an independent trainer. Some of you may work with organisations much bigger than ours. So which is better? Which gives you better ROI? Which is better value for money? All these questions. Now, while we're biased, I think we can still hopefully give an objective view on the pros and cons. I mean, I think if you've got in-house capability, in many ways, that's a great thing. If you're working within an organisation, you really understand it. So that whole needs analysis piece will be so much easier. Perhaps you'll have better access to people, but you'll also know the culture much more intimately.
It's sometimes cheaper if you can do it in-house. But then one of the other things to say is, does it help to have a different voice facilitating the conversation?
Someone more objective.
Yeah, someone who can be removed from the situation. Yeah. And I mean, again, as we said at the start, these are the 5 ingredients, and it's a question of what works for what type of training you're looking for. And in some instances, in-house might work really well. In other instances, an independent might. In others, it might work for a bigger organization. So it's more, as we said, kind of giving you questions to consider.
Yeah. It depends, I guess, on the specialization of the training as well. You might have, someone like me. I'm a generalist, so I do a lot of our working across cultures, cultural sensitivity type programs. But I bring in external consultants when we have a country-specific requirement. I would never dream of delivering programs on India or on Brazil because I don't have that experience or knowledge.
I think if we look at kind of going with an independent or going with an organization, there are pros and cons to both. Sometimes with independents, you actually are able to get quite in-depth and work with them closely. Whereas depending on the size of the consultancy, that can get a little bit lost. But then there are often times that there's like a bigger network potentially or a bigger knowledge pool that if you're coming from a bigger organization, that organization can then provide training needs if you needed training about, say, as you said, like India, Brazil, the UK, Canada, and that can all be under the one umbrella rather than dealing with multiple different providers.
The ability to co-facilitate. We and many of our competitors have global networks of trainers, so I think there are people on the call where we've delivered for them in more than one country because we have that network. So rather than flying the trainer halfway around the world, we have the local expertise as well. The ability to have a substitute trainer. Unfortunately, people do sometimes fall ill, very, very rarely, I'm pleased to say. But
there is certainly something going on in our office at the moment.
That's very true. I mean, do you have a view on this? I mean, you might not want to share, but if you have a view and you're happy to share, do let us know. But we are kind of coming to the end of our time actually, and the end of our presentation. So, I mean, we'll open it up to you. If you have questions, share with us, ask. But as you know, we're always available afterwards. I think you have both of our contact details. We'll also follow up with you in the next day or so with the recording. And perhaps some additional resources that we can share with you.
Perfect.
Should we do the
and
last
then,
bit?
just to wrap up a little bit, for those of you that are based here in the UK, we do have some training about working across cultures, which sort of just the general overview, giving you a sense of your own values and awareness. So we've got, it's sort of our most popular session, and we've got some coming up in April, June, September, and November. And then if you'd like to connect with us again virtually, our next webinar will be taking place in March, and it's all about overcoming the hurdles when communicating with Indian partners. So that should be a very good session if you already work in India, or if you're looking to explore that as a market. But I think that's this. You can find us here.
And all the usual ways.
But yeah, thank you guys so much.
Yeah.
I think for us it was also interesting to try a webinar this way, where it was more of a discussion. And we hope we've given you some good food for thought. And thank you so much for everybody for engaging and listening and interacting.
And we'd always love, you know us, we'd love to continue the conversation. So get in touch independently if you have any questions or comments. But otherwise, we'll hopefully see you on the next one. So enjoy the rest of your day and keep in touch.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.